So to get into the action, I'm really excited about today and the amazing guests we've got with us. And first, I'd like to do the welcome. So first up, we've got Charlie Gonzalez, who's been a HSR in the APS for a number of years now. Charlie's known for his calm leadership and focus on practical risk solutions. He's a senior policy officer in the Office of Pacific at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He joined DFAT from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, or PM&C, where he was also HSR. We've also got joining us another HSR, Eric Rasmussen, who's a Law Interpretation Officer at the Australian Taxation Office, or ATO, where he brings clarity and fairness to complex tax matters. With over 5 years' experience as a HSR and considerable involvement with the CPSU, Eric is known for his thoughtful approach and commitment to creating safe, inclusive workplaces, qualities that make him a trusted voice in both policy and wellbeing conversations. And lastly, I'd like to introduce Dean Dedich, who is a Work Health and Safety Inspector within Comcare's Regulatory Operations Group. With a background in law enforcement and justice, Dean's got extensive experience in sort of regulatory, compliance, and work health safety, and that enables him to engage effectively with organisations, promoting safer working environments, ensuring compliance with national safety standards. And in his current position, he's conducted numerous proactive and reactive inspections and engagements, addressing matters related to consultation, issue resolution across a diverse range of workplace settings. He's really committed to staying grounded in the practical reality. So Dean also regularly contributes to HSR training events in the Brisbane area where he's based, so maintains those close ties with workers and HSRs. So his broad hands-on experience makes him a really valuable contributor to today's webinar. So the focus on today is about moving beyond problem framing and how effective consultation and cooperation can be the catalyst to a safe, thriving workplace and to achieve safety outcomes. So we're going to hear from this group of experienced voices who live and breathe health and safety at work, and they're going to be talking about some of their insights, their challenges, and some of the practical tips. And then we'll look at opening the floor to some of your questions as well as we go. It's worth highlighting the vital role of health and safety representatives that they play in shaping healthier and safer workplaces. Work can sometimes be complex, but it's also incredibly important, and we hope it's very rewarding as well. So with today's mix of perspectives, we'll explore what's working, what's changing, what we can improve together. So switch on, get comfy, pop in your questions into the Q&A box as we go, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those as we can. So let's kick off with a bit of an icebreaker with our panellists. So first, keen to hear about your role as, we'll start with the HSRs, about your role as a HSR and what got you involved in it. So we'll start off with Charlie. Tell us about what got you there.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and hello to everyone joining us today. Thank you so much for making the time. I've always been industrial relations minded. I started in the APS as an industrial relations legal graduate, and what got me involved as a HSR in particular was I had an extensive background with the union and a sense of fairness in the CPSU that Eric was also alluded to in his introduction, and as part of that was really motivated by the changes to the psychosocial space in the HSR setting. So things about the inclusion of loss of job control and those psychosocial hazards and moving safety away from that traditional physical risk. And it's been such a present part of my work in policy-focused agencies. And I wanted to get on board and help out and drive some change in that setting and ensure that all our workers' voices can be heard, particularly where there's such good legislative backing to drive that process.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Charlie. And Eric, tell us a bit about yourself and your role as a HSR. What got you involved? Oh, we've got your mic on there, Eric. Check that's working.
I just assumed we were reading lips. Sorry. My name is Eric Rasmussen. I work for the Australian Taxation Office. I've been with the ATO for 19 years now, which is kind of hard to believe. And I started in the call center back in the day, and I've worked my way through the ATO. The ATO put me through law school, and now I'm a law interpretation officer. And I basically try to prevent disputes between the office and taxpayers before they become disputes. Law interpretation officer is a fancy way of saying lawyer. So that's what I do. That's my day job. I've pretty much always been involved in standing up for workers in the tax office since starting in. And I think I've been a health and safety rep now for about 5 years. In a previous iteration, I was a health and safety rep coordinator, which is something the ATO has to try to manage the thousands of HSRs they have around the joint. And I think for me, my overall passion is that, listen, this is our workplace, regardless of your role, whether you're an APS 1 or an EL2 or, SCS band 30, I don't know what it goes up to. We all work here. And when safety becomes an issue, we're all at danger. And so I'm just passionate about people saying, listen, my workplace, I'm responsible for my safety. How do we work together to keep the workplace safe? And that's my passion, and that's why I do it.
Yeah, terrific. Yeah, thanks, Eric. And Dean, tell us about yourself. What led you to get into the work health safety space and your role as an inspector?
Yep, beautiful. Thanks, Andrew. Look, for me, it was sort of a natural evolution. Like Andrew touched on in the introduction, I essentially come from a law enforcement background. So I always had this instinctive core belief around justice and making sure people are safe and protected. And in my industry too, it was quite unsafe at times. Obviously, you're dealing with people of various backgrounds and histories and things like that. So it was sort of the natural evolution, moving from the front coal face and how safety affects it on the front lines to a more sort of systems-based approach. And that was essentially the motivation to move into Comcare and the sort of systems-based regulation. So it was sort of a natural evolution for me to go from front-facing to localized to more systemic-based safety.
Yeah, terrific. And I understand there's quite a nice arc in there as well for you, Dean, which is sort of seeing from the end of where harm has occurred in various domains to now kind of coming towards the front end towards prevention of various harms. So yeah, it's great to go from the seeing the consequence to the getting up to the front end of more preventative side of things. So yeah, it's also keen to now sort of turn the conversation a little bit towards some examples that you might have seen or experienced. So it might be a work health safety challenge or a story that you've had that's either tested your approach to consultation or problem solving, or one that's worked particularly well. So I might sort of go around the room and we'll talk about an example or so, and we'll sort of draw out from there. So it might start. Charlie, do you want to tell us about an example that you might have had?
Right, thanks, Andrew. I think part of what makes the HSR space so fascinating at the moment is that it's a real shift from, and of course, the physical risks are always present, but in policy settings like mine and where you're in an office space, it's often that psychosocial risk that's paramount and forefront for most people in a day-to-day setting. I say that as well in a department that has a big overseas presence, so I don't want to underplay the physical risks, but really it's in that psychosocial space, and where that's traditionally been led through sort of industrial instruments and through your enterprise agreement rights, things such as your work demands and your EL toil and your overwork and your overtime settings now have this really interesting psychosocial risk and health and safety implications for the PCBU. And that's sort of where I focused my efforts. And I think one example of this that was really poignant was in my previous role at the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet at PMC, in the design of results and studies around EL toil implementation in the department. So that's time off in lieu for those who might not be familiar, where basically executive level staff get compensated for their overtime or the payment or sort of recognition in lieu of that overtime. And bringing a health and safety edge to that really helped shift the dial in the workplace. So it wasn't just a matter of the expectation of the agency or your manager expecting that that it was managed sort of informally, but now there was a legislative instrument that we pointed to, and part of that was that when we did a survey design for staff in consultation with HR and with the CPSU and HSRs there, it showed very strong results about that sort of access to toil or lack thereof in some parts, and bringing a work health safety edge to that conversation to say that these staff are actually at risk of being burnt out, that there are real physical or psychological risks that amount from these industrial traditional instruments, help change the dial and really drove it forward in our conversations with SES and others and representing the individual worker. So it really brought a lens to what was, traditionally an industrially managed thing to having that element of, no, there carries real risk if your staff are working extra hours and not getting that rest and relaxation time. And within that, there are actually enforceable codes that PCBUs and sort of delegates must follow. And when I brought that health and safety perspective to the conversation, it in some ways had more buy-in than it just being a traditional industrial issue, because now people were accountable, there were clear safety standards that were backed by that, and we actually saw the agency sort of taking an approach to draft through scenarios and talk through those very real risks of burnout, the ability to view it through a safety lens and not just an industrial lens, even where those two things are always connected. So I think that's been a big focus of the work, and that's continuing across different agencies that I'm aware of, but it's been one thing that I've been able to drive forward in my role.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Charlie. And Eric, is there an example that you want to draw attention to?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I might talk about something that I'm working on at the moment. So where I'm at, my work group is looking after we call the law design and practice group within the Adelaide office. So, and as part of that, we have, chunks of lawyers doing different things, and I don't want to identify the area because people get embarrassed. But we have a group that are lawyers. So these are legally trained people who shouldn't be shy about standing up for their industrial rights, if you like, or even their safety rights. But it's a good example of how much culture plays into these things. So if a culture isn't available for people to speak their minds and to say what's actually happening, it doesn't matter what education or training or status people think they have. The culture is enough to sometimes get in the way. And the difficulty in this particular area, and it's an area that's not just in the Adelaide office, it's right across the country. They have a presence here, and they have presence right across the country. And the difficulty there is similarly to what Charlie said. It relates a lot to workloads, too much expected out of too few people. But it also comes down to maybe an attitude of, well, you're in this kind of area. It's a bit like a law practice. If you're in a law practice, you'd be all about, being the first one in the morning and the last one to leave at night and run up those billable hours and all that kind of stuff. But of course, we're actually the Australian Public Service. We're the Australian Taxation Office. We're not a law firm. And so there's cultural things that go with that. So there's some behaviors that are taking place between managers and staff. And so the instinct of anyone who's an advocate is to say, in a safety forum, to say, well, some staff in some places are being yelled at. That's not okay. Some people are being driven insane because they've got too much work. Boss, go fix that. What we've done in this matter, and it's myself working with other HSRs and frankly the CPSU, the Community and Public Sector Union, to try to get that nationwide perspective, is to first off gather evidence. So we talk to as many people as we can in those workplaces and saying, what's it like for you? Are these concerns for you? What are your experiences? We do some of that by meetings, some of that by survey, one-on-one conversations, whatever we can, and have presented that to management and said, listen, we need to chat about this. And so we started a dialogue. And fortunately, it also dovetailed in with the fact that the ATO is implementing some psychosocial risk framework action plans. And their initial way of doing that was saying, oh, we got to get this action plan in place. Is everybody happy with this action plan? Oh, great. No feedback. Okay, good. That's our action plan. It's kind of the default. But what we've done is we say, okay, well, you've done that, but now let's tweak that action plan because of this issue that's going on. And so what we've been able to do is to use the fact that that action plan is there and it needs to be developed to find a tangible way of addressing these issues. So we're addressing these issues, but we're also providing a good systemic solution, along with encouraging the employer to deal with the individual issues where, for instance, the code of conduct is being violated, and that's putting people's mental health at risk. So it's a work in progress, but we've got a working group going on it, and that's getting things sorted through dialogue rather than just saying, well, there's the problem, go fix it.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Yes, it's really nice. I could see overlaps or connections between those stories. Particularly one of the things that threads I picked up there was around culture and workplace culture being it's not a static thing, it's a dynamic thing. It depends on who else has come into the workplace and what their expectations have been with previous workplaces. I picked up threads there about psychological safety, and that's safety you actually speak up and those sorts of things. And also quite liked the thread that you had there about systemic solutions as opposed to isolated solutions. That's similar to the things that you're talking about there, Charlie, about the toil example. That you're looking at a more systemic issue, not just as an industrial thing, but connecting it to the work health safety and those sorts of aspects as well. Dean, you've probably got lots of stories, Dean, and we wanted to avoid naming and shaming, but maybe you can give us a couple of examples that you've seen that have either worked really well or haven't worked so well in workplaces, particularly around the HSR consultation and issue space.
Yep, not a problem. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, look, I'll get a bit more of a broader perspective and try to cover whether it's operational or office-based sort of risks and the things I've come across. So that usually when we're involved, in most cases, if it's a reactive, we tend to find that communication is usually broken down or there's been a lot of barriers in place. So often they're the most challenging ones, and there's the complex issues there from both parties, right? But broadly, more speaking, what I found in my experience is, in a lot of cases, what we find, and I'll use an example, not naming names, but there was a particular matter, for instance, where there was circumstances around where the HSR in question, the PCB, you were having issues around what controls were in place, how they were effectively being managed. Now, this can relate to whether it's a psychosocial hazard or whether it's a physical hazard. So you can apply it in any case. Obviously, by the time I was involved, there was a noticeable breakdown in communication. There was quite a lot of animosity. Clearly, it'd been quite an extended process where there was really no moving forward from what the HSR was claiming or alleging that was being controlled, not being controlled, and what the PCBU was alleging that they had in place. One of the things and the challenges obviously identified was quite early was there seemed to be this disconnect and this unclear understanding from both sides as to what the root issue of the problem was. And often it can be that from a HSR's perspective, it can be like what Andrew and Eric were touching on, it can be quite localized, and it's framed from the perspective of the particular injury or hazard, not necessarily maybe from a control perspective, where a PCB you might be looking at it from a control perspective. So often some of the challenges are both parties sort of speaking the same language and understanding what the other side is actually trying to convey. Other things also were that I'd found in some of the challenges, obviously, the framing, obviously the communication around the negative consequences of the issue or the problems, as opposed to framing the issue around positive outcomes and shared responsibility for solutions. So, as opposed to sort of just blaming, trying to reach some sort of a mutual beneficial outcome, keeping the bigger picture in mind. What are we trying to achieve, essentially? The other thing too, where there did seem to be quite a bit of a disconnect, and this ranges, like I said, whether it be psychosocial or physical, is this sort of understanding, not to get too technical, of what is reasonably practicable. There is often quite a big disconnect between what the PCB, what the organisation, your organisation or agency has determined is reasonably practicable versus what people at the coalface think is reasonably practicable. So often at times we'd find, and I'd find in my dealings with, let's say, HSRs, I would ask them, well, what more can be done? And often they would be like, well, look, I don't have a solution, or we don't have a possible proposition. So the argument there would be, okay, well, would that be a possible argument that everything is reasonably practically being done to essentially control that risk? So, to minimize that risk as much as possible. So there's also that sort of understanding of, because it is a grey area, and it's the Act essentially so broad, it caters for all sorts of organisations at all levels, from small to large. So it has to be sort of broad and far-ranging. So that was also some of the challenges, and trying to convey that understanding to both parties. That usually I tend to find that tend to be one of the main underlying themes that would that was apparent across similar sort of cases that involved consultation as a backstop, as a problem. So and I'll touch on later some of the things and positive things that came out of that, but I would definitely say they were the sort of primary challenges that I had experienced in my dealings with these sorts of matters.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dean. And while you're talking there, you mentioned PCBU a couple of times. And I know many of the audience will be very familiar with PCBU being the acronym standing for person conducting a business or undertaking. It's the term that's used in the Commonwealth Workplace and, in fact, the model law legislation. But you can almost substitute employer wherever you sort of see or hear that term PCBU. So for those not so familiar, when we say PCBU, we're generally talking about the employer, and there may actually be more than one PCBU involved in a particular scenario or situation. DFAT, I'm sure you've got plenty of examples where we've got the employer, but you're also, renting or, hiring a site, or you've got, other contractors who might be in, same as ATO as well. So now going to kind of lean into some of the examples where you might have seen consultation or problem solving working particularly well, Charlie or Eric. So, some of the maybe the techniques or strategies or approaches that you might have tried or used, and you've already sort of talked about some of them a little bit, where it's focusing from industrial issues to, we can all agree that, work health safety is important, for example, and what's the outcome. So, I'd love to hear a little bit more about if you've seen particular approaches working particularly well, or not working so well. You might have seen other HSRs or, places where it's been got a bit stuck. Feel free to jump in, either of you. First, maybe Charlie, you can kick off, but feel free to have a conversation there too.
Excellent. Thanks, Andrew. And I want to sort of touch on a similar vein to something that Dean was talking about around, what's reasonably practicable for the PCBU to do. I think it plays into this space really interestingly in the inverse for the sort of employee. So, for example, I think previously, or even still, if you see that there is a heavy box full of files on top of a tall cabinet, it's a very foreseeable objective risk that you can see in most of the times that is likely to cause or is a hazard. It's likely to materialize in that way, or there's a broken ladder or a frayed power cord and all those sort of traditional physical things that can be framed objectively. I think when we're talking about psychosocial risks and workloads and things like that, it's while there are the key risks and hazards that are identified, and those are universal in a way, how an individual responds to that isn't quite as it's not as foreseeable in a sense as some of those physical risks. People respond to stress in different ways and job demands and job expectations. And so when it's a really individualized, subjective approach, almost to hazard identification now. And so one thing that's been really useful, I find, in this space has been really clear consultation with work groups and with the employees in that scenario. So saying that, when there's an updated code or sort of policy that the department puts out, communicating that as a HSR with my work group with clear sort of the headline hazard, whether it's job control or organizational change, but then different ways that may materialize in the workplace, because you're dealing with risk in a subjective way. And I find people engage with that a lot more easily than just sort of throwing just the headline hazard out there. But if you actually give an example or say that, there's really good guidance that Comcare makes on these different points where it actually happen, and people can feel these things in different ways. And bringing the worker along in that process has been really important to get buy-in as a HSR. And I think similarly, I'll tie that thread to something that doesn't work so well. And I think it's where you have HSRs representing a really large work group, or too many representatives. I think it's best when you get to know the workers or the employees in your floor or your space. And that way you can have those personal conversations about, well, actually, this burnt out feeling that you have, this isn't just it can, occasionally be a bad day, but it's actually part of a broader thing around the job and how you're feeling. And there are ways in which we can talk about this with the employer. So I think, having that clearly defined communication about what is and what isn't a psychosocial risk and how that's felt by the employee, and doing it in a context where you have that access to people, where you're not having to rely on representing, dozens of people at a time, that people have access to you and that you're visible and you can talk through this as well. I think that's a key part of this.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Yeah, so there's an interesting thread between it's both the specific and individual, but it's also looking at the broader application and universality of solutions and of outcomes and those sorts of things. Yeah. And Eric, is there something you want to share in that space as well? What you've seen work and
it's interesting. I think we talked about it before about some of the universality of this. I think the difficulty in large organizations, whether it's DFAT or the ATO or even Comcare, is it's very easy to make decisions from a top-down approach, and making decisions from the bottom, which is where a lot of safety lives. It's more difficult. And we've talked about this before, that I think if you think about something analogous like a safety, physical safety risk, like for instance, asbestos. It's an issue that many of us are familiar with. There were companies that were making things out of asbestos, and it seemed like a great product. It's fireproof, it's durable, et cetera, et cetera. From the company perspective, who obviously wanted to make a lot of money, you can fabricate these things and they can be used in a variety of applications. But when it got down to the point where people are actually working with the people who are manufacturing it, the people who are using it on ships or building materials, et cetera, when those people started getting sick, that's where it becomes a much more communal kind of issue. And it's analogous in the psychosocial space, which we're paying much more attention to now. It's very easy for a top administrator of an organization to say, oh, well, we look after people's psychosocial by saying to them, if you have a problem, let us know, and here's a well-being phone number to call through to, and we'll have managers who are basically good people. We'll point them and they'll do the right thing. And that probably seems like enough. If you put enough things in writing, in policies and procedures, that probably feels like enough. But when you're on the workplace and there's, we need to get these widgets done, we need to get this work out the door, and there's a lot of work to get done, and there's only so many people, and I get along with this person, I don't get along with this person. And my management style is much more in your face versus, cuddly and warm. Those kinds of issues, they creep up, and the only way to address those is to have a communal approach. And for me, I think more than anything else, when these conflicts arise, my first go-to is, who needs to have a conversation? Who do we need to meet with? Who has to sit down and have a conversation to help resolve that? Maybe that's just maybe it is an individual issue. Maybe it's a personality issue that we just need to have a conversation with those two people, work out some of those differences. Often it's beyond that. It's structural, it's organizational, and you have to have a wider conversation. But to me, that's the key tool is to talk, to have communication. And I think the challenge for PCBUs is often to put away their pride and desire to control, so that they are open to having those conversations. And for the employees, it's often to take the emotion out of it, to say, right, we understand that this is an issue particularly for you, or you're afraid, and you see what else is going on in the workplace, to kind of try to take some of that away and say, listen, these people aren't out to get you. There's just something that needs to be worked through. and have those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Eric. So, Dean, I'm sure you've seen examples where workplaces get stuck in problem mode, where they might be having difficulty either identifying or agreeing on what actually even is the problem, scoping the situation, and who's responsible for it. Or you might have examples where they've been able to really effectively shift through to solution stuff. So I'm kind of keen to talk about any examples where you've seen that work particularly well or not work so well, and what you might have sort of recognised as some of the difference between where people are getting stuck and where they're able to kind of progress through to getting towards solutions.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Again, I'll take a broader perspective just so that I can cover all the different possible organisations and employers, right? But I mean, obviously, as Charlie and Eric were suggesting and hinting to, I mean, consultation is really the cornerstone of the Work Health Safety Act, right? If we're not talking, how can we possibly get an understanding of what is going on in the workplace in any context, never mind from a safety and wellbeing perspective. But definitely from my experience, where I've seen really consultation working particularly well and there being really good outcomes, obviously there's open and transparent communication. I mean, that's obvious. But with respect from the HSRs, as was touched on earlier, I think by Charlie and Eric, this having a data evidence-driven discussion, because what you tend to find from an organizational level, they tend to obviously formulate the basis of their decisions on data, especially like really complex large organizations, which most APS agencies would be and others within Comcare's jurisdiction. But it all predominantly revolves around data. So obviously, where the HSRs have taken the time, been comprehensive, adjusted collated that evidence and presented it in a manner that can be easily interpreted and understood by their employer. I've had instances too where, for instance, it might be an operational role where it's something there where higher up they don't physically actually don't understand what the particular safety risk is. So therefore, clear articulation as to what the problem was or where the lack of effectiveness in a particular control lies. That was obviously also quite paramount in there being this understanding of where these risks and these hazards sort of remain. Other thing that was really good too that I had found is where HSRs had a good understanding of organisational policies and procedures relating to work health and safety. So having an understanding of what your employer's consultation procedure actually states inside there, because I mean they've got that procedure there for a purpose, and it's an agreed procedure. So under the Act, obviously, unless there is no agreed procedure, there's a default procedure within the regulations. But getting an understanding of what that is, so that if something isn't touched on or done, you can raise that with them and say, okay, hey, look, the procedure itself states we should be doing X, Y, Z. This sort of hasn't been done. And a lot of times it's not done through intention. Sometimes it's done accidentally. We all are quite busy with what we're doing. So it can be an accidental misstep from the perspective of the employer. So it's good to have that awareness and sort of understanding of what that involves. The other one, which is I found really quite good, is having driving solutions-based outcomes via the hierarchy of controls. That's a really and that plays quite well into the psychosocial space that Charlie and Eric were hinting at earlier, right? I mean, when you look at the Work Health Safety Act, the psychosocial hazards were always there and always had to be managed. They just weren't as prescriptive as what they are now with those particular codes of practice coming out and what's in the regulations, right? So it was always there. It always had to be managed. It just wasn't, like I said, as prescriptive. But framing also to try to reach solutions and framing the communication and the discussion with the employer or with your workers from, let's work from top down in the hierarchy of controls. I'm sure you guys have all seen it in that risk management cycle and it's a requirement under the Act 2, under the regulations of, well, we have to start first from elimination and work our way down through to administrative or personal protective equipment controls. And often what we find, especially with psychosocial, it starts from the bottom and goes up. Or actually, it doesn't sometimes go up. It just starts from the bottom. And things like work design are those engineering controls. Possibly there's isolation controls that can be put in place. So trying to steer the conversation back to, okay, well, let's work from that top down, from that hierarchy of control as what's required to get the best outcomes and the safest outcomes, not sort of what's quickest and easiest. So where that's occurred, we tend to find that often you do get the safest sort of outcomes. And sometimes framing that to your workers too, because as into the work group that you represent, they may not necessarily be aware that a particular control is something that's a higher order control. For instance, like let's say, I don't know, you put a call screening on, for instance, and isolate, you put that as an isolation control before you have an aggressive customer on the phone, for instance, right? They may not necessarily make the correlation between the two. So it's, like I said, as Charlie and Eric touched on, going out, speaking with your work group, finding out, getting their ideas about what possible controls could be put in place, and trying to promote those higher order controls. We tend to find that you get better health and safety outcomes with that. The other thing, sorry, just referring to my notes, they're sort of they're the main things that I have found when those sorts of, and also, sorry, I didn't want to touch on, if you can get in early, where there are issues arising, really getting in early and trying to gather that evidence, and that plays into that workplace culture where people start becoming disillusioned, nothing is happening, and then they give up. And what's worse is having people who are indifferent, because when people become indifferent and they've got nothing to invest, that they won't report incidents. You'll just see, but I think you'll just see burnout, and you'll see complete disengagement. And I don't think any employer wants their workforce to be disengaged. So it's a lose-lose for everyone, really.
Yeah. Thanks, Dean. Yeah, some really good points in there. Eric and Charlie were having a conversation before the forum, and some of the points that I think Matt and you, Eric, were making about clearly positioning your role as trying to identify solutions that are practical, with the workplace, as opposed to just presenting the problem. And I'm here to be an obstacle, as opposed to I'm here to help find a solution that's going to help the workplace be more productive and people be more satisfied and happy, but also achieve the outcomes that whatever those outcomes were that has identified or created some of the issues. Is there something else that you can draw on or kind of expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm recalling the conversation. I think going back to the example I talked about with, again, this group of lawyers who are, facing a psychosocial hazard, and bringing together this work group that I talked about before. A lot of the attitude of going into that situation is not to be confrontational. It's not to, cause a stir and make people unhappy, but it's about having a mature conversation with everybody involved about how do we get to solution, and as a HSR, you're often, the change is often needing to be made by the PCBU, to have the conversation around, how can I help you make your workplace more safe.
Works.
That's right. More safe. And when your workplace is a place where people feel safe, where they have the opportunity to enjoy the work, the work becomes more stimulating. The work is the kind of work they want to help other people do and work alongside. That has got to be, no matter what work you do, that has got to be more productive. To be frank, in this particular work area, people don't want to work there long. It's too stressful. They say, well, I can be paid the same amount of money and go work in this other area where it's much simpler. Why would I stay here? And, that is not good for them, because that will not help them move along in positive ways for the mission that they have. But by making the workplace more safe, by working together to work alongside, it's in everybody's interest to be safer. But it is about an attitude. It's about an attitude of, I'm not here to confront you. I'm here to help you. Allow me to help you.
Yeah, great. And Charlie, have you seen anything similar, or had any examples that might relate?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think it's about really making it that sort of education or empowerment through education, in the sense that if you can point to those individual sort of hazards that are universal, it's about how, if you have the controls in place, you have a more productive workplace when you're talking with, the employer or the manager with responsibility for that hazard in that sort of localized setting. And by that, I mean, if you can say that, well, this worker knows that their role isn't going to be pulled in 4 different directions, and sometimes work gets like that, but when it's systemic and when it's repeating, then there are ways in which you sort of talking with the employer and saying, well, hang on, things aren't working here. People are expressing, dissatisfaction, and there's, you can look at some of the, I guess, Dean mentioned the evidence-based before, and sometimes that can look like looking at leave patterns in certain areas, for example. But when workers are expressing that things aren't clearly defined to them, it's about having that viewpoint to drive it forward, that, well, actually, this is in the employer's and the employer's interest to have this sort of work clearly defined, that it's a cultural issue or a cultural opportunity, again, phrasing it in ways that you want to bring management on board if you're a HSR, and or bring the employees in your work group alongside with you, that it's actually a cultural shift that we can all talk about, and that there's a mutual interest in doing this. And I guess it's different from sort of some other, say like union advocacy, for example, because everyone is responsible for safety. Like it's a cultural issue in the workplace. It's a cultural, and not even a right, but actually like it's backed by legal frameworks and the law. So you've got these really powerful tools in your corner to talk about something that is intuitively in everyone's interest to do, but it's about having that worker-centric focus on, well, I don't feel comfortable in my role. It hasn't been clearly defined. How do I bring that voice to management, I guess, in that setting? And I think it starts by having those conversations on the floor and by talking about, that regular checking in, like how are you feeling in your role? Are the policy settings there that enable you to succeed? And if the policy settings are there, if you have really good conditions in one area, are they being implemented in a way that is safety focused, that's giving people the chance to recuperate, that's giving people as Eric said, the ability to go to work, to flourish, and to help other people out. So you're building that culture as a whole.
Yeah.
Charlie just mentioned the O word, so I just need to chime in. I don't know about your organizations, but in the tax office, we talk a lot about risks, and we talk about mitigating risks, and we've got like an SES who's is in charge of the owner of the risks. I don't know. So it's a big thing, but the inverse of a risk is an opportunity. And I think in our safety, and I think that's something that's a conversation that we as HSRs, I think, need to learn to have with PCBUs, which is about, this isn't just a safety risk, it's a safety opportunity. And when you make these kinds of changes, when you make a workplace safer, you make a workplace, again, more productive. That's an opportunity. Any senior manager in the public service is going to want to be able to grab onto an opportunity, aren't they?
Absolutely. And interesting, both of you talked a bit about, policy and procedure, that sort of stuff that's, sometimes top-down driven. And there is, a bit of conversation out there. It's often, they talk about workers imagined versus workers being done, which is almost invariably what you need to do when you're designing a policy. But a particular part of the role of the HSR and consultation actually enables less of that imagination and more of that reality test of this is actually how it might play out, or if you've got a checklist or something, is the language right? Will it actually apply in this situation versus one where somebody's overseas, for example, or somebody's in a regional office, where something might not apply. Because it's often spoken about in when we're talking about big picture policy, about citizen-centric or co-design or collaboration with those at the end. And I think traditionally sometimes we have fallen short in that space as far as consultation and collaboration with workers. And that's some of the examples you're talking about. It's good examples where it has worked, and that creates the opportunity to both create a better policy or a better position or a better control in creating the safety outcomes. And particularly as Dean, you were talking about getting in early. The earlier that you can kind of have that conversation, the less entracted and less caught in the problem you are. When instead of wrestling over the the checklist and the detail, you've actually been right up front about talking about what might the design look like in the beginning, and a checklist might not be the solution at all.
Yep. Can I just chime in there quickly, Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely.
What it does also, it removes the emotion from the actual circumstance, and it's hard. I know some might say, "Oh, it's easy for you. You come in, you've got sort of no skin in the game as a regulator." But even from your perspectives, ultimately you got to keep that vision in mind of what are we ultimately trying to achieve. It's not a personal hit at anyone's personality. And look, in my experience, I've never come across an agency or likewise HSR's workers who don't want to have good safety outcomes. It's just that often there's a misunderstanding about what's in place, whether it's effective, and that's obviously where the tension arises. So that's part of that. And to go to reinforce what Charlie and Eric were saying, absolutely, the positive framing. If you can frame it as you want to be an employer of choice, you're going to have less issues around training, recruitment, leave, absences, absentee. And there's a lot of data and there's a lot of ComCare resources with respects to that. So, and if that's what can possibly drive the change, or at least the discussion, a conversation, I would definitely push it from that perspective, because obviously that's where an organization is looking at it from their perspective. They are looking at it from the safety perspective, but they also do have that business planning focus that they have when they're looking at issues or how to manage those issues.
Yeah, thanks. And something interesting I picked up from Eric, you're talking about kind of mindset, and mindset matters. That it's that kind of coming in with that sort of solution, or I'm not here to be the obstacle or the problem. I'm here to actually create an outcome that's good for the workers, but also effectively works. I'm guessing, Dean, that you might have seen a bit of that, where there's an assumption of motive, that both the workplace and the HSR is assuming negative, where it's intracted, they're assuming a negative motive behind, they're just trying to be difficult, or they don't care about us, they're just trying to squeeze every last bit of juice that they can, regardless of what that am I on point there, or am I
yeah, you're on point, Andrew.
Yeah.
That's often the challenge, honestly, when we often get involved where there's been that breakdown in those relationships. Unfortunately, it does become this us versus them mentality, and it's not. You're the one organization. And I can tell you from my experience in dealing with the agencies, often at times they're like, look, we think they've almost sometimes come across helpless because they don't know what else to do. Essentially, they've looked at it and gone, we think we've done everything that's reasonably practicable that we can. We don't know sort of what else we can possibly do. We think it's being controlled. So yes, there is this unfortunate us versus them sort of mentality by the time we often do get involved. So that's why I try to say, look, just try to remove yourself back a little bit. Try to and ask yourself the question, what am I hoping to achieve? What's the outcome? Because ultimately, if you think Control A needs to be implemented, whatever it is, right? If other things are in place that you may not necessarily have awareness of, but you become aware to those, be open to the fact that maybe they actually are effective and they are working, and ask that the organization, well, can you give me some sort of evidence or information that backs that your assertion up that this is effective, right? And not sort of being pigeonholed and sort of narrow-minded about, okay, well, this is the only possible thing that can work. I often use the analogy of it's physical, so it's easy of a car. It'd be nice if all cars had roll cages in them, but it's not reasonably practicable. And we've got all these other controls, such as getting training and being qualified to seat belts and airbags and speed limits. All these controls on aggregate work together to try to minimize the risk. So, and one might say, oh, well, it's not, to eliminate the risk would be the best. Yeah, well, to have no cars, ideally, but that's not really practicable, is it? So it's just keeping an open mind as to what's in place. Is it actually effective? And then asking those further probing questions. Can you give me some sort of information to back up your assertion that this is working?
Yeah.
I think Dean, on that point too, I think the ascribing motive to these issues, I think that more often happens when the right person isn't in the room. So if the decision maker isn't in the room with the HSRs in question or the workers in question, then it's much easier to say, for instance, in the COVID scenario, we had some issues here in the Adelaide office about were we opening up too soon? Were we bringing people back in the office too soon? And the impression we got here was that decisions were being made nationally, and those people weren't in the room. So we were being left to talk with the people locally, right? And as a result, what happens is you ascribe the motivation going, well, they're just doing what they're being told. That's their motivation. They've got orders. And at that point, consultation breaks down because the people who are actually making the decision don't seem to be in the room. I use that as an example, not to keep festering on that issue, but I think all of us need to be aware that if you're going to have a meaningful conversation, the right people need to be in the room. You need to have the right conversations at the right level.
I think if I can just jump in on that point, and it's along the same vein, it's that famous saying, like, never attribute to malice what you can to ignorance, right? And I think a lot of the time there's a tendency to sort of implement that top-down instruction, but when you actually have the discussion with the decision maker, they're often not aware that that's the way that the advice is being implemented in the workplace. And I've found that sometimes it's really key to just sometimes if you're looking at those localized manifestations of risk, localized examples of risk, it's sort of cutting out, and of course they're part of the journey, but it's cutting out the people in the middle and going to the PCBU or their delegate where possible to talk through that risk with them, because then you get it straight from the horse's mouth. Like, you get that guidance and then that trickles down, but you're empowered to do that as a HSR, and I think that's what makes part of the role so exciting.
I'll just quickly touch on that too, just to reinforce what Charlie and Eric were saying. Yeah, look, it's definitely helpful. I have found that often at times you might be dealing, we get the same thing. We might be dealing with a representative from an agency or an organization that doesn't necessarily have full awareness and visibility of how certain decisions were made or come to. As a HSR, you have those powers if it relates to something related to your work group. You have those powers, and we'll touch on that later, hopefully, around tools and resources that you have. But you have that option to say, look, can you put me in touch with this person or that person, someone who can better inform me as to why this particular decision was made, so on and so forth, or what's the evidence to back this, your assertion around this particular control, because often there is someone who does have that a bit more insider knowledge and expert understanding of why a particular control was put in place or why a particular action was taken. So by all means, engage with your organization and ask those sort of probing questions.
Yeah. What's the kids go, the Chinese whispers that, the further you are, or distance from the decision maker, those multiple levels that, the communication gets, reinterpreted multiple times, that, may become very fixed in position that, because such and such above and because above them has, said this is what we've got to do. So you're right, having the, what Eric was talking about, having the decision maker ideally in the room, you're getting it direct from the, the source, of what is our decision making, flexibility, having those conversations, early, etc. So yeah, you've already led quite well, Dean, to sort of start talking about some of the resources or supports that might make a difference. So have you found any particular tools or resources or supports have been effective? Eric, Charlie, or I'll start with you guys, and then Dean, feel free to mention.
I think, yeah, there's I think I will sort of give a shout out to the Community Public Sector Unions Safety First network here. So having on hand those legal and industrial experts to sort of go through scenarios and guidance planning has been a really big resource for me. And part of that too, I guess, you know, is a HSR to encourage people to do the training, 3-day course as soon as possible. But and this is from someone, you know, I came into this with industrial relations legal background. I have a little bit of exposure to this, but I learned so much in that course just around, you know, the volumes of guidance that's literally there through ComCare and the codes of practice and guidance materials, and reading through that and just knowing what tools are available to you is really empowering as a HSR. So I guess the sort of the organisational support, the guidance that ComCare puts out, and then a third element to me is just talking to your colleagues, and I mean that, you know, at Prime Minister and Cabinet, I set up a Teams chat with other HSR representatives where you could just talk about things on the floor, from, you know, the everyday like visibility around walking around corners to those big cultural issues around burnout and stress and workloads. And so having that information exchange, you know, locally is just as important as accessing those broader tools for me.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think both Charlie and I would echo what Charlie says about the involvement of your union. And I'd say that, you know, HSRs don't have to be members of unions, obviously. But the unions are there. The unions have a role. They're in the Act. And they are, whoever your union is, and I think most of the Commonwealth Public Service, it is going to be the CPSU. You can go and ask for help. Say, hey, I'm a HSR. I'm not a member, but I'd like the CPSU's help in this safety matter. And I can guarantee you that they'll be interested in having a conversation with you. Probably ask you to join along the way. It won't kill you, but they will be there to give you some advice on safety matters from people who's basically, that's what they get paid to do. Obviously, ComCare is a huge tool as well, people to go out and be able to ask questions of. The other things, more basic things, basic tools like listening to people, talking to people, those tools are invaluable. And the ability to have the title is a tool. You are a HSR, you're empowered under the Act to go and ask questions. You say to the employer, say, listen, I have some questions about this. How can we get these answers? And insist on getting answers if you need it. And again, ComCare can be of assistance in that. And I think insisting on a conversation in the first place is usually the way to go. Obviously, there's a slew of powers that we have, but our biggest power is really just to have the conversations and insist on consultation. You know, if something's not safe, then that's the role.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I like that. Just the title itself and the fact that you're empowered under the Act is certainly one of those tools and resources. And you mentioned training there, which is great. Network, which is CPSU, and hopefully your HSR network as well, whether you have one internally or beyond. Of course, the handbook for, you know, some anchoring into some of those the facts around your role as well. And of course, ComCare also has a WHS help desk also as well that you can contact via email. Dean, I might have stolen your thunder there if you had some bits that you might have wanted to add.
Yeah, that's essentially it. Like, you guys have pretty much touched on it. The only other thing I'd put to it, I definitely recommend, like Charlie was mentioning, codes of practice. They're very, very effective, and it does demonstrate really what an organisation or a PCBU, an employer, would reasonably know as to what sort of minimum standard would be. So they're great as sources, and you've got ones from consultation to risk management to psychosocial. So they're fantastic. Obviously, look at your agreed, as I touched on earlier, your agreed consultation procedure for your actual organisation. If your organisation does not have an agreed procedure, just be aware for those HSRs who are new to the role or might be unfamiliar, even if we have workers listening, there is a default procedure under the regulations that, in lieu of an agreed procedure, they're the minimum requirements. And what we find is most agreed procedures are literally sort of a copy of those agreed procedures. So that's the issue resolution. For consultation, sorry, there is no agreed procedure. The procedure, the outline of what's required is in the Act. Sorry, I should say I was thinking of issue resolution. But if you, in lieu of the actual consultation procedure, which I haven't seen anywhere. Most organisations will have a consultation procedure. They may not have an issue resolution procedure. So I do apologise for confusing people. But look at your consultation procedure, because that pretty much, I have not come across one consultation procedure that doesn't cover the main points under Section 47 of the Act and 48 around when it's required to consult and what's involved in the actual consultation procedure. So really familiarise yourself with that. Other thing would be, which is a great tool, is documenting. Documentation is quite important. And the reason I say documentation is quite important is if it ends up happening where we are involved, if you can have documentation to sort of demonstrate what you've done with respect to raising concerns, raising issues, things like that, it plays into your case, or from your perspective, for us to go, oh, okay, we can see that there has been this gradual escalation, something's been going on. It makes it easier from our perspective in terms of looking at the evidence as to see what's been raised and what has happened or what hasn't happened. But likewise, it provides also evidence-based information for you and data that you could possibly present to the PCB if required. And like the other stuff that we touched on, the approved HSR training, I'd highly recommend it. It obviously empowers you to do, it gives you certain powers under the Act. And look, get familiar also with what your powers are under the legislation. So the HSR handbook is great for that too. But if you ever, have some time, it's great to see what you're able to do and what the obligations of the PCBU are with respects to HSRs. So familiarise yourself with that. I know you guys all have actual substantive positions, but if you ever do get stuck, you can always refer to that, or likewise, you got the workforce safety help desk and unions and so on and so on. There's a plethora of resources out there. So yeah, there's a lot of guidance.
Yeah, thanks. Eric, you mentioned the importance of consultation, and Dean, you also talked a bit about that there as well. A question that's come through from the registration and in the Q&A there is there a way that workers and HSR could actually compel the PCBU to consult with workers around WHS issues they've raised?
I think the consultation procedures that Dean was talking about before, that every employer should have in place, and if there isn't one in place, there is the default consultation procedures that are in the regulations. So yes, they have to consult. I mean, that's in the DNA of the Act. There has to be it's everywhere. There needs to be conversations. If there's a safety matter that it's come to your attention, and the employer won't speak to you about it, I'd be on the phone to ComCare very quickly.
Yeah.
I just want to clarify, sorry there, Eric, to correct you and correct myself. There is no default consultation procedure. There's a default issue resolution procedure. So that would obviously happen if consultation breaks down and we're not moving it forward. There's a default issue resolution procedure essentially to bring both parties to the table to actually have to talk about what the problem is. But let's take a step back. With respect to the consultation side of it, because under the Act, it's if you're not consulting, you're obviously going to be non-compliant and you're breaching the Act, right? So there's a legal requirement to have to consult, right? And that's why I say consultation is the cornerstone of the Work Health Safety Act, because how else are they to identify hazards if you're not speaking, if the employer is not speaking with the people who are actually at the coalface doing the work, right? It makes no sense. So that's why it becomes sort of the cornerstone and foundation of a lot of the Act. And you can see it in that risk management cycle around identify, assess, control, and evaluate. There's always consultation sort of happening at every point, right? So in terms of compelling, you can't compel them, but what I would say is you raise it to them and say, oh, hey, you do understand that under the Act, there's a requirement to have to consult. Now, you don't have to quote which section of the Act, but that's where I say that documentation is really paramount. And you can even look at their own consultation procedure, and you'll find probably in most cases in their own consultation procedure, it says we must consult when we are implementing changes, identifying risks, so on and so forth. So bring it back to their own policy and their own procedure that they've got, because those policies and procedures exist in order to make sure that they are doing what the Act is requiring of them.
Yeah, great. And so, yeah, another one that's come through is around how can HSRs influence leadership to foster healthier cultures and build trust in the workplace? Charlie, have you got any thoughts on how HSRs might be able to influence leadership in that culture space?
Yeah, and it almost links into the last question in a sense, because it's, if you're not consulting, then you're not compliant under the Act. So there's an obligation for your leaders and for employers to be doing this with employees, to be consulting with their employees. But, if it is if the newer culture in your area, then one way of building trust is I find practically it's like speaking at my division meetings or speaking at my work group meetings, where I actually outline the role and outline the legislative responsibilities that we have and that we're empowered to do. And organizationally, across the board, I think there is recognition, especially in the very senior levels of the organization, to take work health and safety really seriously. And so when you kind of build that bridge between the top of the organization and as a HSR, you start to have those conversations. And I'll pick up too on a thread that where, often and in my roles, like other roles as a union advocate, so, most of the time you have those good relationships, but it can be, you're representing a cohort of the workforce. You're not representing the workforce as a whole. When you're talking about safety as a cultural thing, it is something that everyone is a part of. And I've had a lot of buy-in from seniors and building trust around my role as a HSR, because they know that, I'm in some ways I'm helping them be compliant in the workplace, and that if you have a better safety culture, then you're actually helping that productivity, that leadership, that safety that's important. So you get that trust from the outset, because you are doing a really important corporate duty. And so if there's a new manager or someone starting in a team that I'm working with, or someone who doesn't know much about our role, it's about having that conversation from the start, say, well, this is what I do, this is how I do it, and it actually helps you because we're building this culture of safety. And I think you often then get the flow-on effects of management sharing decisions with you a bit earlier, or things to consult, and that really just helps build that culture. And I think you're starting from a really strong position, because it's something that everyone's responsible for, everyone's accountable for, and you're helping that process.
Yeah, thanks. We're starting to draw towards end of time, but Eric, is there something you'd like to add in that space as well?
Listen, just quickly, I would endorse everything that Charlie said. Probably in top of that, I would add that there's a great power in gathering evidence. As Dean said, keep a record of your, attempts to consult, for instance. The other thing you should keep a record of is the evidence. If something is unsafe, why is it unsafe? What makes you think it's unsafe? What are those data points? Having solid evidence that you can present in a discernible way is extremely powerful, changing culture. Can't ignore it.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Eric. And Dean, any sort of final words?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just echo what Charlie and Eric were mentioning. I would say, look, I'll keep it sort of short and sweet. Just try to remain solution focused. Demonstrate that the goal is mutually beneficial. Obviously, safety improvements. Pull back and try to assess the broader picture. Try to remain objective. That's probably one of the hardest things to do, is just to remain objective. Clear and persuasive communication, breaking down complex safety issues, explaining how and why, how that matters to leadership. If they're not across the complexities, you might find that more in an operational context. Participation, in terms of broader safety, you might find participation in health and safety committees. You might have state committees, then you might have people who are represented at the national committees. You might find that you tend to get senior leadership at those national committees. So you do have a bit more reach with respects to that culture within the actual broader organisation. And to Eric's point, data-driven evidence provided to leadership demonstrates your reasonable belief for why you feel activities are uncontrolled, or I should say risks are uncontrolled, or if they're ineffective, so on and so forth. We are so data-driven, so definitely they're the sort of main points I'd say.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. And thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate your contribution through the forum today. One of the things I can certainly draw out of it is the HSR's really got that strategic influencing role. It's also a great development, opportunity for someone too, because it's really kind of you need to really finesse your communication skills, your ability to do issue resolution, to do stakeholder consultation and influence outcomes, particularly where you don't have necessarily all the control. So, I think if you could do this role particularly well, then, it sets you up for, kind of almost any role in the public sector, in fact, and beyond, to do particularly well. Also probably worth employers, of course, thinking about, there's really that opportunity to use the HSR role to help support change management. So as consultancy, a supporter of the consultation and communication approach with your workers to draw out issues in ways that you might not have had mechanisms for in other ways. So look, as we wrap up that forum, we really want to invite you to take what you've heard, the stories, the strategies, any sort of sparks of insights, and turn them into action. So whether you're a HSR, you're a worker, you represent the employer, you've got the power to move beyond just identifying the problems and become that real catalyst for change. So we encourage you to really start a conversation, to share an idea, particularly a safety idea, of course, challenge old ways of doing things, and most importantly, consult. And just remembering we've got that a webinar coming up next week on workplace consultation as well, with a few examples from employers and others around consultation and what's worked for them as well. So let's keep building safe and thriving workplaces together. So a big thank you to all of our presenters, our speakers, for sharing their insights. I hope you're leaving with ideas, practical tools and new connections. But before you as the audience go, we'd love to have your feedback, as I mentioned at the beginning. There's a short survey that will be hitting your inbox shortly. You can also scan the QR code, which is on the screen now, or use the link that's pinned in the Q&A post. It only takes a few minutes and really helps shape future sessions. So stay updated, subscribe to Comcare's e-news and follow us on LinkedIn for the latest resources, research and events. As I said, the recording of today's session will be available soon on Comcare's website to be able to revisit or share with colleagues, or if you missed the live. Thanks again for joining us. Take care, stay safe, and I hope to see you at the next forum or event.